Usually, society places this immediate assumption of guilt on that impulse. Like, if you feel the need to talk about your good deeds, the assumption is that you're just a hypocrite.
Right, like you're just a show-off looking for applause.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But today, we are actually challenging that assumption. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are exploring a really short but incredibly dense text today titled Part 1, The Warfare Weapon Trap.
It's a fascinating read.
It really is. So our mission today is to look at the internal warfare of the mind from a strictly psychological perspective. Specifically, we're examining why humans struggle so profoundly to, do good deeds in secret.
And the source material actually begins with a pretty famous concept from the book of Matthew, chapter 6.
Oh, right.
Where Jesus issues this rather radical command to keep your good deeds in the shadows. Do your charity in secret, pray in secret.
Right.
But what makes this text such a compelling psychological study is that it completely bypasses that easy surface-level accusation of hypocrisy we just mentioned.
So we aren't just, analyzing people who are faking piety for social clout.
Exactly. We are looking at a much more complex internal landscape. The text argues that our failure to keep things secret isn't driven by arrogance at all.
Wow.
Yeah, it's actually driven by a deep hidden fear.
Which completely flips the script on how we view our own motivations, right? I mean, we have to stop asking why a person is so desperate for attention and start asking what that person is so intensely afraid of.
Right, precisely.
Like, what is the internal warfare that makes the shadows and secrecy itself feel so dangerous to the human mind?
Well, to understand that fear, we really have to look at the psychology of the feedback loop.
Okay, break that down for me.
So the source text makes this really bold claim that publicized good deeds actually stem from a nagging, hidden anxiety that our private devotion simply isn't, quote, enough.
Not enough.
Yeah. When you perform an act in secret, you are intentionally depriving yourself of an external feedback loop. There's no one there to say good job or validate that you're a good person.
Just total silence.
Total silence.
Yeah.
And in that silence, insecurity begins to germinate. The brain starts to wonder, if no one witnessed the act, did it actually carry any weight?
Oh, that makes so much sense. Think about doing, an incredibly difficult, massive project at work.
Okay, yeah.
You put in the late nights, you solve these complex logistical problems, and you end up saving the company a massive amount of money.
Yeah.
But let's say absolutely no one sees you do it.
Right.
The boss is on vacation, your coworkers are just focused on their own tasks, and the problem just gets solved invisibly.
Yeah, you're the silent hero.
Exactly.
Oh.
But you sit at your desk the next morning, and without an audience to acknowledge the effort, your brain almost starts to question if the achievement even matters. Like, you find yourself wondering if you actually accomplished anything of value.
That captures the psychological discomfort of secrecy perfectly. The human mind is fundamentally wired for social reality.
Right, right.
We evolve to understand our value through the reflection of the tribe, When you do a good deed and no one is around to validate it, you are denying your brain that social mirroring.
So it's almost like it didn't happen to your brain.
Basically, yeah. Your mind actually starts to doubt the reality of your own goodness. It creates a vacuum. And as we know in psychology, a vacuum of validation rarely stays empty for long.
No, it definitely doesn't.
It sets the stage for a massive internal conflict. The moment you begin doubting if your private devotion is enough, you leave your mind vulnerable to an internal attack.
Okay, so if our brain starts doubting our invisible achievements, what actually fills that silence? Because according to the text, the feeling of not enough escalates pretty rapidly into a full-blown crisis.
It does, and it's driven by an internal psychological mechanism that the source identifies as the accuser.
The accuser, that sounds intense.
It is. The accuser basically represents the hostile internal critic. This is where the internal warfare of the mind really shifts into high gear.
Okay.
And the mechanics of this attack rely heavily on the fragility of human memory.
Wait, memory. How does memory play into this?
Well, think about it. You might have performed your secret charity perfectly, right? You offered your fervent prayers behind closed doors. You showed subtle, anonymous love to someone in need. But time passes. And as the memory of your private service naturally begins to fade, and as you start to doubt the real-world impact of your unseen actions, this internal accuser steps right into the void.
And it weaponizes that uncertainty against you.
Exactly. It uses the fading memory of your own goodness to generate shame. The text describes this accuser whispering, or honestly, eventually shouting that you were lazy.
Wow.
It insists that you're completely ineffective. It takes that initial, quiet fear of not enough and amplifies it into a devastating attack on your core identity.
So suddenly you aren't just doing too little, you literally are a failure.
Yes. The resulting emotional state is what the source calls spiritual panic.
Spiritual panic.
It's a visceral, crushing sensation. You feel this immense weight of guilt, convinced that you have let everyone down, including your own spiritual ideals.
That's terrifying.
And the most fascinating angle of this attack is that the accuser isn't pointing to terrible crimes or malicious acts you've committed. It targets a perceived lack of action. It exploits the silence of your secret deeds, using the complete absence of external validation to convince you that your internal life is entirely empty.
Okay, hang on. Let me just stop and look at this from the perspective of the listener, because I feel like there's a logical gap here.
Sure. Lay it on me.
If I know for an absolute fact that I gave secretly to charity last month, like if I know I sat in my room by myself and prayed fervently for an hour, I was there, I experienced it firsthand, why wouldn't my own direct experiential knowledge of those acts be a strong enough defense against this inner critic?
It seems like it should be, right?
Yeah. Why can't I just tell myself, back off. I know I did those things, regardless of who saw them.
It's a great question, but it's because human memory doesn't function like an objective video recorder.
Right.
It's highly reconstructive and heavily dependent on external corroboration. The text provides a really profound explanation for why your own knowledge isn't enough. It argues that the accuser is able to strike precisely because those works were hidden. Because your actions were invisible to others, they were never depthly registered by your own mind, what the text refers to as the self.
So the lack of external feedback literally weakens the way my brain encodes the memory of the event.
Yes, exactly. In cognitive terms, memories of our own actions are solidified through social anchors.
Social anchors.
Right. When you do something publicly, the reactions of others, their gratitude, a smile, a word of praise, those act as sensory and social timestamps.
Oh, that makes sense. They give the memory weight.
They give it weight and tangibility.
Yeah.
When you operate in total secrecy, those social anchors just do not exist. You only have your solitary experience.
Wow.
And over time, the self struggles to maintain the reality of that unanchored event. The memory degrades. It begins to feel almost dreamlike because it lacks the friction of social confirmation.
That is a staggering concept. Because the deed was invisible to everyone else, it eventually becomes invisible to me.
Exactly. The self fails to register the full weight of the righteous act because it occurred in a vacuum.
That's wild.
And the accuser, that internal critic, exploits this exact cognitive vulnerability. It knows your internal memory of your own goodness is fragile without social proof.
Yeah.
So when you try to defend yourself against the feeling of shame by recalling a secret prayer you said, say, 3 weeks ago,
That memory is just too faint.
it's so faint and unanchored that it simply shatters against the very loud, very present physiological feeling of guilt and spiritual panic.
Right, and when humans feel defenseless, when our internal shields shatter and the shame becomes overwhelming, we don't just sit there and take it.
No, we definitely don't.
We scramble for better armor. We go looking for a weapon that actually works against this feeling.
We realize subconsciously that our internal memory is just insufficient to fight off the panic. Driven by the fear of being not enough, we begin searching for a more potent defense mechanism to combat the accuser.
We need something solid.
Right, something undeniably real in the physical world.
And so we decide the best defense against this invisible internal attack is to just drag our actions out into the light. We publicize our good deeds.
Exactly.
We develop this desperate need for a physical audience, not because we want to be worshipped as heroes, but because we need tangible validation to prove to ourselves that we have value.
We're trying to build a fortress out of other people's perceptions.
Yes. And the source text captures this dynamic with such a brilliant phrase. It calls it building a credit file.
The credit file. It's such a good analogy.
It really is. We display our good deeds to accumulate this file, which we then use as hard, irrefutable evidence of our worth.
Right.
So when the accuser attacks and says, "You are ineffective," we want to be able to point to the audience, point to the applause, and point to the public record.
We use the external validation to say, look at my credit file. Other people see my value, therefore my value must be real.
And that concept of the credit file happens everywhere.
Yeah.
Not just in spiritual context.
Oh, for sure.
Think about the folders we keep on our computer desktops. You get a highly complimentary email from a difficult client or a glowing performance review from a manager, and you drag it right into a specific folder.
The brag fold.
The brag folder, exactly. And you aren't doing that to show it off to the world. You do it so that 6 months later, when massive imposter syndrome hits.
And your brain insists you are a complete fraud who doesn't know what you're doing.
Yes. You can open that folder, you read those physical emails to prove to yourself that your competence is real.
Yeah.
We are doing the exact same thing psychologically with our good deeds. We are hoarding public praise to use as ammunition against our own internal shame.
It's like keeping the lights on in an empty theater. Imagine acting out an entire complex play to a completely empty auditorium.
Oh, yeah.
You know you hit your marks, you know you remembered every single line perfectly, but when the curtain falls, there's just dead silence.
Ugh, that sounds awful.
Right. Without the applause at the end, without the audience reacting to the performance, you start wondering if you were just talking to yourself in the dark.
Did the performance even happen?
Exactly. The credit file is our way of making sure the theater is packed, so we never have to doubt the reality of our own performance.
So how does this alter the way we understand the concept of public worship or, like, publicized charity? Because the text makes a point that when people display their good deeds, it isn't always hypocritical boasting.
No, not at all.
It's a defense mechanism born of fear. We actually start to fear that our secrecy is somehow hiding our righteousness from God.
Right. In the grip of spiritual panic, our psychological wires just get crossed. It isn't that we logically believe God requires an audience to see our actions.
Right, that wouldn't make theological sense.
Exactly. Rather, we project our own psychological need for tangible proof onto the divine. Because we cannot trust the invisible, we subconsciously fear that the divine won't recognize the invisible either. We need the physical audience to validate the act, to make it, real enough to count in the grand scheme of things.
So we're essentially using them.
Yes, we use the physical audience to silence the internal accuser. But by doing so, we fundamentally misinterpret the nature of faith.
How so?
Because faith inherently requires trusting the unseen without a credit file to back it up.
That is so profound. Let's take a step back and look at the whole picture here.
Sure.
We started with the ancient command in Matthew 6 to keep good deeds secret. We move completely past the lazy assumption that people who boast are just arrogant hypocrites.
Right.
Instead, we uncovered this complex, deeply human internal warfare. We learned that we use public approval as a psychological weapon against our own fading memories, our inherent need for social anchors, and our profound feelings of inadequacy.
It's a lot to process.
It is. We are essentially fighting a phantom internal accuser using the applause of a crowd as our shield.
This exploration reveals just how incredibly vulnerable the human mind is to its own self-doubt. The mandate to operate in secret isn't just about avoiding arrogance.
Right.
It's a profound psychological challenge to exist without external validation. So the next time you feel that overwhelming itch to broadcast a good deed,
Or to post about your charitable donation.
or casually mention a sacrifice you made for a friend, pause. Ask yourself a really difficult question.
Which is?
Are you actually sharing this for the benefit of the people watching? Or are you desperately trying to build a credit file to silence your own internal critic? Are you genuinely seeking connection, or are you just reaching for a weapon to fight off your own spiritual panic?
That completely reorients the way we judge others, too.
It really does.
When you see someone posting about their good deeds online, you might not be looking at a show-off. You might be looking at someone who is running out of internal armor, grabbing whatever external validation they can find to fight off the terrifying fear that they are not enough.
It replaces instinctual judgment with empathy. Operating in the invisible is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it is.
It requires a massive, cultivated amount of internal security to do something beautiful and then let it remain entirely unseen, trusting that the act itself is enough without the social timestamp.
It really does. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today, something that builds on this idea of using the audience as a weapon.
Okay.
The source tells us we build this public credit file to silence the internal accuser, right? We use the crowd as our primary defense mechanism against shame. But think about the nature of an audience. Crowds are incredibly fickle. Attention spans are short. Eventually, the audience always looks away.
Always.
If your internal peace and your entire defense against the accuser becomes completely dependent on a physical audience for validation, what happens to your mind when that audience inevitably leaves the theater? Does the internal warfare just start all over again? Only this time, you have no weapons left to fight it. Think about that the next time you feel the itch to bring your secrets into the light.
It's a profound psychological trap and one that is very difficult to escape.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.